Good afternoon, Admiral Carter and General Sattler and Captain Byrne and our distinguished guests that are with us today. My name's Art Athens. I'm the director of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership here at the Naval Academy, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome you to this Volgenau Honor, Courage, and Commitment Luncheon. The Stockdale Center here at the Naval Academy, our mission is to empower leaders to make courageous ethical decisions. And part of that mission is not just oriented on midshipmen, as much as we love the midshipmen and as much as it's important for them to be great ethical leaders in the fleet and the operating forces. We're also interested in the broader community here at the Academy of making sure all of us continue our leadership development. So this lunch is one of a series that goes with something we call Influence the Influencers. Because those of you who are not midshipmen, you're all part of the influencing process to prepare these young men and women to go out and serve in an honorable and extraordinary way in the Navy and Marine Corps. So the reason we have this lunch the way it is, it's a small group. You get to interact with staff, faculty, coaches, people you may not normally interact with on a daily basis in a social setting. We bring in speakers from various backgrounds and areas of interest, and our speaker today has a very unique background and what her focus has been on, and I'll be introducing her shortly. This particular luncheon is sponsored by Dr. Ernst Volgenau and his wife. Dr. Volgenau is a 1955 graduate of the Naval Academy and a former Air Force officer who helped develop space boosters, satellites, and computer systems and taught in the field of astronautics. He's the founder and chairman of SRA International, an information technology firm of about 6,000 people, which was listed on the New York Stock Exchange from 2002 to 2011 and is now privately held. SRA is headquartered in Fairfax, Virginia, and for 10 years in a row was on the Fortune magazine list of 100 best places to work in the United States. Sarah Volgenau, his wife, is a 1957 graduate of Morehead State University and taught in elementary schools for several years. Dr. and Mrs. Volgenau have 3 married daughters and 9 grandchildren. We're very grateful for Dr. Volgenau and Mrs. Volgenau's support for this program, and I'd now like to introduce Chaplain Carter, who will bless our food before we start into it. Please.
I'm actually better looking than Chaplain Carter. I'm Chaplain Cash, that's okay.
Chaplain Cash. And I should tell you, I was going to introduce you this way, but I didn't, but now that I blew it and used the wrong name. So you've heard of Johnny Cash, and I always, when I first met the chaplain, I said, you're not like related to Johnny Cash. Yeah, oh yeah, I am. And then I found out his dad actually played with Elvis Presley, right? Isn't that true? They picked together, and this is a unique man. Anyway, Chaplain Cash.
I will not sing this prayer, I will just say this prayer. I invite you to join me. Almighty God, the author of every right desire, and the one in whom we find our strength and pardon, grant to us that virtuous life to which, in our very best moments, we all aspire. Grant us fidelity, that we might be better friends to one another. Grant us love, that we might see our fellow man and woman the way you see us. Grant us prudence and wisdom, that we might rightly discern truth and resist the siren song of pride. Grant us justice, that we might rise above contempt and demonstrate mercy. Grant us courage, that we might count the cost for all these things for which we've asked. And above all, grant us self-control, the fruit of which is a life in which others can place their trust. Into your hands we commend ourselves, this prayer, and this wonderful meal before us. Thank you, Lord, for all good things. Amen.
I actually used the wrong name just to demonstrate why stories are so important. You always got to have a story ready just in case you blow it like that, you know, and Annette will tell us more about that as we enjoy lunch. So please enjoy this lunch, and I'll be back in a little bit to introduce our guest speaker. And thank you, Chaplain Cash, for that prayer. Thank you. So our guest speaker this afternoon is Annette Simmons. For 2 decades, Annette has inspired audiences to find and tell powerful stories that spread new ideas, build leadership, and guide behavior despite increasingly unpredictable circumstances that we face. First published in 2000, Annette's book, The Story Factor, was named one of the best 100 business books of all time. And The Story Factor and Whoever Tells the Best Story Wins, her second book, are now international classics. Her books are published in 11 languages. And on a personal note, I read The Story Factor a number of years ago. And the principles that I learned in that book have had a great impact on how I use stories, both to individuals and to groups. Because one thing I've found is we've much rather listen to a story than look at a PowerPoint. So stories have real power, and it really does move people to action. I think we are going to be really encouraged by what Annette tells us today and how we can apply that in our individual lives and in our leadership responsibilities. So please join me in welcoming Annette to the U.S. Naval Academy.
Hey, how y'all doing? I'm not from around here. You may be able to tell that. I'm actually from Louisiana. Do I have any cousins in here? All right. How you doing? What part of Louisiana are you from?
Tullis, right above Alexandria.
Oh, okay. I'm a little further north of Shreveport, the less fun part. My daddy was a federal probation officer, and my mama was a school teacher. Now, I'm not sure kind of what y'all's background was, but I'm guessing that your parents were role models for you in terms of living a life of service. Certainly mine were. Although my daddy thought, well, you know, maybe there's a way you could live a life of service and not have to deal with red tape, you know, not have to deal with the whole federal government bureaucracy and everything like that. So he decided that I should go into business for myself. And my father values clarity and focus. Clarity and focus. And so he was concerned that some of the electives that I wanted to take in high school weren't exactly focused. So I wanted to take art. I wish I could move this back. I probably can. I wanted to take art. So Daddy says, no. You want to take okay, maybe not one. You want to take mechanical drafting in case, oh, thank you. In case you decide to become an architect, because Daddy had decided that I could be a doctor, a lawyer, or an architect, whichever one I wanted. So I took mechanical drafting. I took mechanical drafting, and then it came time to choose a language. I wanted to take Spanish. Dad says, no, you need to take Latin in case you become a doctor or a lawyer. So me and all the other cool kids in high school took Latin. And then came time for me to go to LSU. I went as far as I could, but still get in-state tuition. I wanted to study psychology, and that was my daddy's fault because he would give me all the books that he had gotten when he was trying to reform his clients. Remember, he was a probation officer. And I had been studying psychology since I was like 13 years old. Well, he said, that's a waste of time. So he let me study marketing. And if you think about marketing is really psychology because it's the psychology of influence. And what's interesting about that is that if you're not good at it, you don't get to do it again. So in a way, marketing is a more rigorous form as opposed to some other practicing psychologists. So I ended up all the way to the end of my undergraduate degree, but then it was time to go to law school because I had told my daddy I was going to go to law school. I cannot tell you how much I did not want to go to law school, but I was afraid to tell my daddy I didn't want to go to law school, so I moved to Australia. It was a very effective strategy, perhaps a little overkill, but it certainly gave me an opportunity to study psychology in all sorts of different contexts. Because the cultural differences, I thought it was the same. Being American, I was raised to believe that, you know, focus and clarity are good things, and I was focused on American values. It's not the same. You know, they look like us, they speak English, they dress the same, But that in the middle of Southeast Asia, and also they've got a little bit of a different history. Like, for instance, I can tell you exactly who in my family goes back, great-great-great-grandparents. You ask them about their family, and they're like, well, we really don't know, because a bunch of them were convicts that came from Britain. So I understood that the individual it's all about pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. And if you think about it, we have metaphors in our language that tell us how to be. There's some other metaphors. For instance, the early bird gets the worm, right? And so we use these metaphors, and then we don't realize that there are values. And that in some places, perhaps the values are different. For instance, in Japan, the metaphor they use is the protruding nail invites the hammer. In Australia, they have what they call the tall poppy syndrome. Those who rise above the rest. Guess who was taught to say, hey, my name's Annette Simmons, and I'm good at this, this, and this. And they're like, whoa. So I got a chance to study human behavior at a much deeper level than I thought I was studying when I was just studying psychology, because there are cultural elements of it. Now, we have been brought up to value our objective rational thinking skills. We value clarity. We value focus. But what I learned, certainly with my father's clarity and focus that I would become a lawyer, was that doesn't always work. Sometimes there's something else going on. And when I discovered storytelling, it was well into my career. I had already done marketing for 10 years at an international level. I had shifted to leadership training, done group research. The first book I wrote was about territorial games, turf wars. I'm sure y'all don't have any of that competitive business here, but sometimes people withhold resources. And then I wrote a book called A Safe Place for Dangerous Truth, because it occurred to me that if people would just tell the truth in the staff meeting, and we could talk about the difficult things to talk about, then it would be a lot more efficient. I found out that there are lots of reasons why people don't tell the truth, and I also found out that truth is dependent on the point of view from which you're looking. If anybody ever comes up to you and says, you want to know the truth? I'll tell you the truth. They're about to share their opinion with you. But there are also big T truths. There are truths that were true before you and I were born, and they're going to be true long after we're gone. And these big T truths very often encompass paradox. There are these big T truths are what fuels the invisible forces that keep us on track. Now, the objective, visible stuff, you can do the focus and the clarity thing with. But the invisible stuff, what we're talking about, people really don't want to hear any more of your information. They've got more information than they can deal with right now, and they don't want to hear one more piece of information they need to fold in. But I can tell you what they do want from you. More than anything, what I want from you. We're desperate for it these days, and that is faith. People are craving faith that you are a good person, that you are here for the right reasons. And faith is in the realm of emotions, because you're believing in something that is unseen. There's no kind of clarity and focus when it comes to faith. It's a feeling. And I've learned that feelings can actually alter facts. You put your facts into a group of people who are resentful and angry, and what do they do with your facts? This is interactive part. What do they do with your facts if they're angry and resentful? They dismiss them. They discredit them. They attack your source. So that feelings can actually disappear facts. Now, feelings can also pump up facts. I could tell you how my father first described my first job to other people, and it would be a little inflated. I mean, I was basically putting mailing labels, but on magazines. But he says, "Oh, she's working for a local publication." So facts are not as powerful as feelings, and yet we spend so much time looking at facts. Well, when it comes to honor, courage, and commitment, is there always a clear, focused, and way to demonstrate courage? Because courage is going to mean different things in different situations. Sometimes courage means speaking up. Sometimes it means keeping your mouth shut. How do we communicate with each other about what our values mean when they can mean so many different things in so many different situations? The best way I know is storytelling. Now, if you want to study storytelling, the oldest and richest institutions in human history use storytelling as their marketing concept, their training tool, and that even build their structure off of story. What would those institutions be? Oldest and richest? The church, right. Religion. And religion has that focus and clarity thing going on, but it also has that mystical thing going on. So I like to think of it as you got two different groups. You got your dogma dudes who have the rules and the laws, and then you have your mystics. And your mystics are the storytellers and help people to keep thinking. See, laws, they tell you not to think, just do. Stories invite you in. Jesus, in our Christian tradition, I would call a mystic, because during his lifetime, he was asked 183 direct questions, at least according to the New Testament. How many direct answers do you think he gave? 2. Depending on your judgment about that. Mostly stories. Because the answer, when we're talking about our values, very often is, it depends. So when a Pharisee is trying to demonstrate with the duality of right, wrong, that he was wrong, he said, isn't it against the will of God to heal on the Sabbath, because it is against the law of God to work on the Sabbath? Now, when I'm in the South and I ask what story Jesus told back, I usually get, a whole bunch of hands raised. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I'll just share the story. The story was, if your ox falls into a well, would you leave him in there, or would you get him out? Now see, for me, that illustrates what story does. Dogma, the law, the rule book, the policy manual is all about the looking from the outside in. It doesn't matter what the situation is. This is what you do. But in values, very often depend on the situation. And so that one story takes a Pharisee who thinks they knows what right and wrong and says, if it were you, what would you do? Storytelling is the way that we embed our values with a personal application in a way that causes others to think personally about what they mean when they say courage. What do you mean when you think about courage? What do you mean when you say that you have the value of commitment? It depends. But it's important for you to understand, for you to have your own story. When I was working with a group out of the Pentagon, they had hired me. This was before I'd written anything about storytelling, I think. And they had hired me to help with a budget meeting. Now, some of you have experience with budget meetings, and some of you are going to have experience with budget meetings, if only at home. And what happens is that when we go into a budget meeting, especially from a military framework, We call a budget, we use a metaphor, and the budget is a battle, and we want to win the resources, and we don't want to lose resources that we had last year. And so I find a lot of people, when they're coming into a budget meeting, are actually operating from a place that this is a war, you know? Go to war for our budget, go to battle for our budget. Now, this group had been asked to cut their budgets for 3 years in a row. The first year that your budget is cut, what you decide is, well, we're just going to have to do more with less. Tighten our belts. The second year that your budget is cut again, what usually happens is everybody has a heart-to-heart conversation. They say, okay, we're going to have to figure out what we're not going to do anymore, because we don't have the resources to do everything we always did. And you decide what services that you're not going to provide. And then you go back out and you start operating by those principles that you decided, and you get a phone call from somebody up there. And the phone call says, you know what, I understand you need to cut some services, but you're not cutting that. And you end up, for the third year, having to do everything you did with not enough budget. Well, that's the situation that this group was in. And so they hired me to come and facilitate because they were a little frustrated, a little angry. They were having a hard time. Now, I knew from experience kind of what story they were telling themselves coming in, because these people were having to fight each other for budgets, and all of them thought from their point of view that they had vital services they were trying to provide. So I decided to use poetry. Now, I told them that we need to talk about testosterone. And they looked at me like, did she just say that? Testosterone is your friend when you're in a war-fighting situation. It's an emotion. And right? And it fuels your body with all of these molecules that help you to focus and get clear. It takes all of this peripheral information coming out from different directions and focuses it so that you are looking at your objective and nothing but your objective. You are ignoring any sort of pain that you feel, and you're ignoring other people's pain because you are on a mission. Now, in warfighting situations throughout thousands of years, leaders knew that we needed to pump up these feelings in order to win a battle. And so one example comes from Henry V. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, or fill this wall up with our noble dead. In peace, nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness. But when the winds of war blow in our ears, stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, and disguise fair nature with hard favored rage. Let the eye pry through the portage of the head like a brass cannon. Let the brow o'erwhelm it as doth a galled rock, or hang and jutty the confounded base, swilled by the wild and wasteful ocean. By the time I got to about that point, they're all going, hoo, hoo, hoo. They're like, with it, ah. That's the emotion you want to generate when you're in a warfighting situation. However, we're here for a budget meeting. So I pulled from an old poem by Billy Rose called The Unknown Soldier. I said, let's think of another emotion that will help us make better decisions. There's a graveyard near the White House where the unknown soldier lies, and the flowers there are sprinkled with the tears from mother's eyes. I stood there not so long ago with flowers for the brave, and suddenly I heard a voice come from out the grave. I am the unknown soldier, the spirit voice began, and I think I have the right to ask some questions, man to man. Are my buddies taken care of? Was their victory so sweet? Is that big reward you offered selling pencils in the street? Did they really win the freedom they battled to achieve? Do you still respect the croix de guerre above that empty sleeve? I wonder if the profiteers have satisfied their greed. I wonder if a soldier's mother ever is in need. I wonder if the kings who planned it all are really satisfied. They played their game of checkers, and 11 million died. I am the unknown soldier, and perhaps I died in vain. But if I were alive again and my country called, I'd do it all again. Do you feel the atmosphere difference between that first story and the second one? From that point on, everything that happened was unfolding in a very different way because of the story that we decided to tell ourselves about who we were and why we were there. More willing to make sacrifices, a different definition of courage, a different definition of commitment. We were there to take care of the housing and homes of soldiers who were deployed. And it made a difference. So I ask you to think about what your stories are when you talk about values of courage, honor, and commitment. Honor is kind of a hard one. I can't get a straight answer from anybody about what honor is. In terms of behavior, you know, it's like, okay, courage is you're afraid to do it, you do it anyway. Commitment is you do what you said you were going to do. Honor gets all sorts of different definitions. My definition of integrity could be, you know, keeping my mouth shut or speaking up. But integrity is something that if it hadn't cost you anything lately, you know, are you sure you still have it? Because doing the right thing when everybody could see is not necessarily a big deal. But doing the right thing when nobody would ever know whether you did or not, that's a different story. And that's kind of, honor is kind of hard to talk about. It's one of those values that's hard to talk about without a story. So I want to share the story that came to my mind when I was thinking about honor. And this is from Africa. It's about a young warrior, and his sister married a man from another tribe who was very well born, but had been blinded. And so he was really bummed out that now he was going to have to go hunt with this guy because that was the tradition of their tribe. And he's like, well, I'm going to have to be the eyes for both of us. It's going to slow me down. He didn't have a very good attitude about it. So on the morning that they were to go hunting together, he was a bit chatty, this guy. And he loved to talk. He was very concerned about what he was concerned about, if you know what I mean. So as they're walking out to go hunting, he's nattering away, and then all of a sudden his blind brother-in-law stops and says, I think we need to stay here. It's like, what do you mean you think we need to stay here? I knew he was going to slow me down. He could feel the vibrations of elephants stampeding through his feet. And so, sure enough, if they had gone forward, they would have been right in the way of the stampede. Later on, he stopped again. And they had heard the birds, but what this man didn't realize was because his brother-in-law was blind, he was more attuned to the sounds, and that the birds were making the sounds they made when a predator is around. And he could hear the predator go from left to right and start to come towards them. And he says, "Run, brother, run." And so they started running, and then he was like, oh, okay, because he could hear the sound as the predator turned around and went the other way, and they were safe again. When they got to the spot they were going to, they were there to catch some birds because the feathers of the brightly colored birds were very valued in their tribe. And the man set a trap for both of them But it was late, and they wanted to go back. And he didn't really have the time to cover up the trap for his brother-in-law, and he couldn't see, right? So it didn't really matter. So he covered his up really well. And then they returned and slept the night, getting up the next morning to go back to the space and see what they had gotten. As they started to get closer, the man realized that in his beautifully well-hidden trap, there was just this little small brown bird. But in his brother-in-law's trap, somehow, he had captured this gorgeous parrot with the colors that his wife would love to see as gifts that he brought back. And as he got closer, he found it really easy to say, "Oh, brother-in-law, I am so sorry. You've only caught a little brown bird. Here, I'll put it in your pouch for you." And he took the brightly colored parrot and put it in his own pouch. As they walked back, remember, he's quite talkative. He was gossiping about people in the village, and he says, that's really irritating. These families have been fighting for so long. Did you know that they crushed the farmland of their neighbor? And they went on and on about these fights. And he said, why do people fight like that? He didn't really expect an answer from his blind brother-in-law, but he got one. He said, because they do to each other what you've done to me. And they walked on in silence until finally he asked his brother-in-law, he said, will you forgive me? I'm so sorry. Here, take both birds. How do people become friends again? They treat each other as you have treated me. And that's just one of my favorite stories that talks about what we think people see and what people actually see. And honor seems to be something that comes from the inside out. It's not about focus. It's not about clarity. It's about who you tell yourself you are and why you tell yourself you're here. These are really important stories in your leadership journey. And what I wish for you is that you have very clear stories about who you are and why you're here. And I encourage you to think about the stories that you would tell if you were asked, what is courage? What is honor? And what is commitment? Best of luck. Thank you.
So, because we want to keep everyone on schedule, we have a few moments for questions, which is a key part of this, to actually explore a little bit deeper, in this case, about this subject of stories. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll get your question for Annette, and she can answer it about storytelling.
Any questions? Come on, y'all. Who's heard of storytelling like as a subject before? Yeah.
I have a question. Lieutenant Commander Jack Ryan, fellow word nerd from the English department. In that story of the Pentagon, I'm curious if you found certain techniques other than the storytelling, bringing the perception and the awareness of the audience to the story that they're telling themselves, finding ways to bring them out of that story or seeing the possibility that the other side is as true and valid as theirs.
I have kind of a technical answer to that because, if I can, I value focus and clarity. Remember what I said about the dogma dudes and the mystics? That's a division that I think about as objective thinking and subjective thinking. So subjective thinking is from your point of view. And when we're trying to figure out from somebody's point of view what that means, it's important to understand what story they're telling themselves. And if you're there to influence them, it's probably not the story you're telling yourself. And you're thinking they need to have your story. What I've learned is that if you can first validate their story, if you can first say, you know, I can really understand how living in farmland that you would have concluded, and that makes a lot of sense to me. What you do is you invoke the law of reciprocity. Because when you give a story, you get a story. And when you get a story, which is what you've asked them to do, and you validate it, then you earn the right to tell your story. And so I highly recommend that there be that two-step process. I think it's very hard for someone to listen to your story when you haven't listened to theirs. Yes?
Ma'am, I had a question. You mentioned how proverbs and storytelling can link it to society's values. Have you come across the idea of creating stories for the point of creating new values, artificial ones at that, especially with identity?
As a matter of fact, I have a very specific answer to that question as well. Singapore was invented, from scratch. Singapore is the only place that didn't have to fight for their independence. They actually just got kicked out. And they had to scramble for their identity, and were very intentional about doing that. One of the first things they did is they commissioned an artist to create a symbol. They knew they wanted symbols. And the symbol they created was called the merlion. It's half lion, half fish. And this symbol didn't mean anything, really. It's just they knew they needed a symbol. Well, over the years, Singapore's invested in storytelling. As a matter of fact, they have professional storytellers that are hired by the government to go into the schools and to teach values and ethics. And one of my friends is one of those storytellers. Now, in Singapore, you can't, there are rules about free speech. And they do have one area where you can speak freely as long as it's not about religion or politics or probably anything else important. So the storytellers have a little more freedom because if you have a play, you must get this script approved by the government. But if you're a storyteller, stories are told different ways in different situations. It's not that you're making it up in the moment, but it's co-created. And what's happened for Rosemary, my friend who's the professional storyteller over there, is that the merlion has popped up in these children's stories that she tells. And the merlion is always saving the day or coming in just when some character is in trouble. And so the merlion now has, legends are being created that tell the story of the symbol of Singapore. So that's an excellent example of I don't believe that you create a story that's not true. What she's doing is adding the merlion in to traditional tales. That big T truth, I wouldn't trust myself or anybody I've met, really, maybe a few people, to make up a story, because there's just something reliable about a story that's lasted over 2,000 or 3,000 years. And you can always find a story if you look hard enough. And so what she's done is she's just let the merlion come into those already ethical, reliable stories. You're welcome. Anyone else? Yes.
First of all, thank you for coming to talk to the midshipmen. I was fascinated with your cross going after this budget and storytelling. In the last couple of years, the Navy, and I'm talking at the highest levels of the Navy, have been wrestling with this idea that we're not sure we're creating the right conditions to build the future strategists of the Navy. And some of this comes from discussions in the Pentagon, and we're going through this even today as we're wondering whether we have the right resources that will drive a strategy, or we build a strategy and then we fill it in with the resources. So there's this discussion about whether strategy is ends, ways, and means, or is it something else? And I, along with a very small cadre of others, try to convince our senior leadership that strategy was really the skill to be able to tell the right story. So I'm interested in your perspective, as you are a world-renowned storyteller, and your perspective on how that connects to the future strategists of our business.
There's a military concept, VACU, V-A-C-U. Are you familiar with that? Variable, ambiguous, complex, and unpredictable. Okay, so that's our environment right now. And so clarity and focus is not really, working. You can come up with a strategy. Our old-fashioned strategies were that, end objective, and then you just work to get there. But you don't really know at any point in time. So scenario planning is where corporate strategists went to first. And it's interesting that corporate strategy, Shell uses scenario planning. In order for them to continue to be profitable in South Africa, they noticed that apartheid would have to end. And so in their strategies with this story, they came up with a couple of plausible ways that would happen and began to seed the idea with a story of somehow peacefully ending apartheid. Now, I'm not saying they invented Nelson Mandela, but they set the stage. And I think scenario planning is absolutely the way to go when you can't predict the future, and we don't need any more evidence that we can't predict the future. I'm sorry to hear it's a small group. Anything I can do to help, that would be great. Yes, thank you. Well, I want to say thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. While my father did not understand my career choices, he now has decided that they must have been okay. Because when I told him I was coming here, he was very proud. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share my thoughts. And if I can be helpful in any other way, email me or call me. Thanks.
So we have at the Stockdale Center a compass that we give to our speakers. We like to think of it as the moral compass that you can have on your desk. And there's certainly a lot of stories that go with Admiral Jim Stockdale, of who the center is named after, who spent 7.5 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam and led those prisoners in a successful way to return with honor. And his books tell many, many stories, and we hope you'll enjoy having this conference. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.